physical release and why it could be standalone as well. Let's discuss the possibilities in this video. Let me know what you think in the comments down below and don't forget to hit that like button. There is a story expansion coming to Horizon Zero Dawn, that much is confirmed. I already discussed what I want from this DLC in another video, be sure to check it out if you haven't already, but I kinda stumbled upon an interesting tweet that I wanted to discuss. Here, Thunderlight01 asks the game director of Horizon Zero Dawn, Matthijs de Jonge, if there will be a physical release of the story expansion. He replied with a simple sentence, quote, "Can't say yet," end quote. And I always think that if it wasn't the case, why reply at all? I can imagine that he gets a lot of messages. I mean, I sent him one recently, didn't get a reply for example. I asked him if the story expansion was DLC or that they meant new game, because it wasn't really clear in their communication. But yeah, Matthijs de Jonge didn't reply, even with "I can't say yet," he didn't say anything. So yeah, that he replies to Thunderlight00, of course nothing against him, shows me that there is more to this answer. But of course I shouldn't read too much into it, I still thought it was interesting to note. But let's say that there is indeed a physical release for the story expansion of Horizon Zero Dawn. What would that mean? Well, a couple of things. For example, it would mean that it's pretty huge. I mean, if they go out there and make a boxed version of this, it will probably have a ton of content. If it was just 5 hours of new content, it doesn't really make sense to make a boxed copy. If we for example look at Infamous First Light, another Sony first party game that got a physical release for the DLC, that's around the 10 hours of new content, something like that if you really see it all. I think that this is like the minimum for Horizon Zero Dawn, because it's also an RPG, so I think that 10 hours isn't really that weird to expect for a story expansion. If we look at The Witcher 3 with Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine, those expansions clocked in around the 10 till 15 hours of extra content. Only Hearts of Stone had a physical release, but that was a limited edition one with some real life Gwent cards. They kinda had to do that because it was simply not worth it for them to make packages, ship them, have retailers take a cut if it was just a $10 disc. So it has to be a higher price than that. So if Horizon Zero Dawn, the story expansion, will be physical, I think the price will be around half of what the base game was. Remember Shovel Knight that had to increase the price for retail to $25 from the digital download that was way cheaper, because stores will only give it a great spot in the store if you are above a certain price, otherwise you're kinda a budget title. So that's why they had to go with a higher price to be up there with the other premium games. So if Horizon Zero Dawn, the story expansion of that game, would get a retail release, I think it's safe to assume that we're looking at $30 or something like that in our local game store. But I will go way more in depth on what I think the price for the Horizon Zero Dawn story expansion will be in another video, so stay tuned for that. Another interesting thing to note is that looking at the other PlayStation exclusives that got DLC, and with PlayStation exclusives I mostly mean Sony first party IP, like The Last of Us, Infamous, Guerrilla Games' own Killzone Shadowfall, and of course Uncharted 4 with the yet to release Uncharted The Lost Legacy. They all got standalone DLC, meaning that you don't need the base game in order to play this DLC. If Horizon Zero Dawn involves a separate story, or maybe the story of Rust and what happened to him that we get to play it ourselves, that would be totally well suited for a standalone story expansion. You don't really need the base game story for that, just like the Alley DLC and the Fetch story for Infamous. So that would make more sense as a physical release as well, because then you simply don't need the full game to play it. Otherwise, regular people that buy games in stores will take the disc home and then see, oh, I can't play it. So that's not really the ideal situation. So that's why if it was going to be, if the story DLC will have a physical disc, then I think it's most likely a separate story to the ones that we got in the base game. You might be thinking, hey, you missed one PlayStation exclusive, one Sony owned IP that got DLC where you indeed need the base game to do it, and that's of course Bloodborne. But to get to this premium DLC, you needed to go to to a location in the base game as well. And personally, I think that it made a lot of sense to include this in the base game, that you need the base game to play this, because this DLC was harder. This was really for people that liked Bloodborne, so people that already played the base game. Not really noob friendly, so it didn't really make sense. While in the case of Horizon Zero Dawn, it could totally be that the story expansion is a standalone story, that you play someone else and follow that story. It makes way more sense than in the case of Bloodborne. So while the tweet kinda made me think about the fact that Horizon Zero Dawn story expansion could be a physical release, it's not the reason that I think that this will happen. I'm not 100% sure, but looking at the recent Sony first party IPs that got DLC, we kinda see a trend here. I think that Horizon Zero Dawn also totally lends itself, like I already said, for a standalone story expansion. It simply makes way more sense. Since I don't think they will expand the overall story with a DLC that maybe not everyone will play, then they will create some sort of weird situation with the next game that people that only played like the base game of Horizon and then jump into Horizon Zero Dawn 2 or whatever it will be called will have no clue what's going on because they missed the DLC. And yeah, it will be for a fact that more people play the base game of Horizon Zero Dawn than the DLC. So to round it up, I think a standalone story makes sense for the DLC. That it will be someone else. That it will not be about Aloy and the overarching story, or that Aloy will just go somewhere else. That the main story is still going on, but it's not like the central thing around this DLC. I would be fine with it either way. I'm super curious to see what it is. I will talk about when I think we will see this DLC, when I think this DLC will probably release in a lot of upcoming videos. So be sure to subscribe, and I'm curious, what do you think? Will Horizon Zero Dawn, the story expansion, get a physical